Welcome to the Practice You podcast. My name is Elena Brower. Let's dive into today's conversation regarding life's myriad transitions and how we refine our responses in our relationships, our wellness, our households, our work, and in our practices. You are invited to learn and love and listen with me. Welcome to Practice You. Welcome back to the podcast. I have with me a new friend today who feels like an old friend because her book is so intimate and beautiful. Alua Arthur is here. She's the author of Briefly, Perfectly Human. It's going to be on my favorites for 2024. It is a gorgeous book about death and life, and I want to read one of the passages from the end of the book to introduce our listener and to ensure that you stick around because you will thank me that you did. We can spend our lives fretting about our deaths, or we can use our brief time to sink deeper into the experience of being human for all it entails. The good, the tricky, the impermanent. We can acknowledge that our death will one day come and use that knowledge to create a life so whole, so honest, so juicy that it is worth leaving. I have seen over and over human beings' personal reckonings in the final moments of life. It begs the question, what must I do to be at peace with myself so that I may live presently and die gracefully? Thank you, Alua, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. Your book is beautiful. I want to recommend that our listener also listen to your TED Talk, which I will include in the show notes as well. I want to start with the fact that you started, as I did, thinking I needed to do something like this. You started in law school. I started in corporate America. Talk to us a little bit about the realization that law was not for you, even though you were doing great work.
Thank you. But I should have probably listened the first time when I was due to go to law school. I'd spent the summer beforehand in Thailand and kept changing my ticket. I did not want to come back. And slowly the school that I had committed to and paid like early registration for said I could no longer come because I'd missed the timeline. And we went down the list of all the schools that I'd been accepted to. And finally, one of them said yes. And it was like the very, very last school. But I had to drag myself away from Thailand. And so I think in its inception, it probably was not a good idea. My body was saying, girl, what are you doing? Stay where you are. But I went anyway. And it was a slow decline for about 8 years of me constantly just trying to shift my focus and pretend what I was hearing in my body and my spirit that this wasn't a fit. I kept trying to silence it and kept trying to keep pushing forward and try something new and maybe look at it this way and try to form myself into the shape of a lawyer, and it wasn't quite working.
Right. I'm so grateful that that happened because so many hundreds of thousands, millions to come people will be introduced to a warmth around the concept of death and dying because of that. You left law school. There was a particular trip, the trip to Cuba, when you encountered Jessica, who at first I thought she was stealing your bag. I swear that's where my New York mind went straight to, oh my God, she's taking her bag on the bus and she is not coming back. Oh my God. And then I realized that Jessica was in fact saving you a seat and you got on the bus with her, and the sort of snap judgments that you had about her, from her tattoo to the way that she was talking, the answers to your questions, was so interesting because it really helped me reflect on my snap judgments about so many things. And it really is one of my practices this year to suspend all knowing and all judgment and all agenda, really. But reading about you learning that Jessica was, at the time you thought, a terminal cancer patient was really shocking. And then I'm not going to do the spoiler alert about that little car accident that you had that forced the meeting between the two of you, but that was where she told you where she'd been in that moment was pretty incredible. I would love to hear your thoughts now from this perspective, having written about it and from hindsight, What has Jessica and meeting her taught you about how you want to be with the dying?
One of the things that I love so much about meeting Jessica, and this is only obvious to me in hindsight, is that it was a hard left turn in my life. And the hard left turn occurred just because I kept following the little breadcrumbs that life was leaving for me about what direction to go in. And by that, I just mean my curiosities and the things that sparked my interest and things that made me more curious about something. I leaned in, I asked a question. I didn't think, oh, that's curious, and then just move on. I was like, why is that so curious to me, or what's actually going on there? And through that curiosity, I uncovered this new work. I mean, it was a little bit before the work really formed itself, but being able to sit with Jessica on this bus and ask questions about her life and then her death, I found myself the most present that I'd been in a decade, as far as I could remember. I was totally tuned into this human in front of me. There were champagne bubbles in my blood. I was hanging on to her every word while simultaneously something was starting to dissolve inside of me, thinking, well, shoot, I wish everybody had an opportunity to talk about their mortality. I wish that she didn't have to walk through this journey through this alone. Everybody here is going to meet their end. Why are we not talking about this? So slowly the facade about our I don't want to say immortality because it sounds so silly because I know that we're not. But up until that point, I'd never properly considered the fact that all of us will one day die. And on the bus, I did. And that facade started to crumble. And gratefully, it opened my eyes to how we can be with people that are dying. My curiosity is the thing that led me there. And my curiosity is one of my favorite things about me. And staying curious about somebody in their living experience, and particularly in their dying experience, I think is one of the most powerful gifts that we can offer.
Thank you for that. I now would like to fill in our listener on your bio, which I think now is a better time. As we have mentioned, you're a recovering attorney. You're also the founder of Going with Grace, which is a death doula training and end-of-life planning organization. Okay, so if you're listening and you're kind of just coming to the realization that you too are going to die and that your family is going to have to manage that, it might be interesting to work with Alua on planning. I know it sounds crazy, but I already kind of have mine planned if I have the gift of planning it. It may be of interest and it may be of benefit to your family. And if you're older, let's say you're in your 60s, 70s, I can't wait for that. But let's say you are, and you haven't really thought about this. Just go to her website. It's beneath the episode that you're listening to right now, and just have a poke around and see what actually death doula work entails and what that means for you. And maybe it might be something that you might be interested in as a service in training to become one. I know that the moment my mother-in-law passed, I was with her death doula, who happens to be a really good friend of mine, Sierra Campbell, and learning about medical assistance in death because we live in one of those states, and watching her through it was what got me inspired to actually start to volunteer in hospice. I'm less interested in being a death doula and much more interested in just going and sitting with people as kind of a volunteer, like kind of an intern. I find a lot of gratitude and reward in that work. But I do want to point out the fact that this is what you do. You've been featured on The Doctors. You've been in Disney's Limitless docu-series with Chris Hemsworth. You've been in Vogue, InStyle, LA Times, The Cut, The New Yorker, The New York Times. As I mentioned previously, your TED Talk has already received well over 1.5 million views. And the subtitle of the book is Making an Authentic Life by Getting Real About the End. And I want our listener to read the book, so I'm not going to go too deeply into your history, even though I really want to talk about 1981 and what that was like running from a coup in Accra and your dad going to prison for 5 months. And I would like to just briefly touch in on the experience of entering into a primarily white neighborhood in Bethesda, Maryland as a little girl, and what that was like for you and how you sort of managed that experience, because I found that to be a very big folded page, big touching part of the book for me and my understanding.
Well, for starters, thank you for that really beautiful introduction into my work and how we're doing it. And also, Sierra Campbell is a graduate of our end of life training program and also a friend of mine. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I did not
Yeah.
know.
I was curious if that was part of the connection. When you said that, I said, oh,
No, your
Sierra.
people emailed me and they were like, we think this is a connection. And I was like, so do I, actually. And I don't usually say yes to these emails. And this was like so obvious. How wonderful.
That is
Thank you
wonderful.
for training her. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Well, she came in with a decent amount of knowledge, as many folks that come to doula training do already. And we got to partner on a few things, which was really a delight. Please send her my love next time you see her.
I will. I will.
And I'm glad to hear that you had her support as your mother-in-law was dying.
It was epic. Years of it, in fact. And she was the reason why I was so relaxed. I wish I'd had her when my mom passed, but I didn't. I was so not knowing, and my mom passed in really not optimal hospital conditions where I wish I would have known better. But hindsight.
Always.
Tell us, please.
Always.
Accra, 1981, Bethesda.
1981. There's a military coup. My father is a member of parliament, and we live in housing that houses the members of parliament. And the soldiers for the opposition are coming to the house. They're coming to the building to come and snatch all the members of parliament and haul them off to prison. And I'm 3 years old. I am holding my father's hand. And only as an adult did I learn that the memories that I have are from the coup. These are my very, very first memories of life. But I remember flashes and I remember some panic and I remember chaos around me. But mostly I remember feeling very, very calm and still with my dad holding on to me. My father has always been that, very grounding force in my life. And for that, I'm very grateful to have a good model of that in a parent. Eventually, after he was released, we got political asylum and went to Bethesda, Maryland. And I was almost 5, I think, when this happened. I don't remember so much. I do remember a lot of white people. I remember it was cold. I remember that my dad wasn't with us for a while because they had seized his passport and it took him a while to join us again. I remember getting a brand new baby sister. I remember a bit of shock to my system, but I think as a kid, we learned how to adapt to our circumstances pretty well because we kept adapting from that point forward. My parents became missionaries, Christian evangelical missionaries, and we kept traveling. So I kept learning how to adapt to new circumstances over and over and over again until we settled in Colorado Springs, Colorado, when I was 11.
Wow. Thank you for that. And where do you live now?
I live in Los Angeles.
Yay and not yay and yay.
All at the same time.
All at once. I get it. The sort of next place I would love to go, I like being really practical and really efficient on this podcast. And I want to serve the person who's listening who is suddenly interested in learning what it means to be a death doula. What would that work look like for them?
Well, theoretically, a death doula is a non-medical, holistic support person for the dying person and their circle of support through the process, handling emotional, practical, spiritual needs, offering resources, knowledge, a hand, a heart, etc. When I say the dying person, though, I'm talking about anybody who has come into awareness of their mortality. So that means even somebody who is healthy, who has been like, oh boy, one day I'm going to die. I should probably do something to prepare myself for this. We can help healthy people complete comprehensive end of life plans and work through their fears of death. We support folks doing death meditations, just a place for them to be at home in exploration of mortality. When somebody has a diagnosis, we can support them in creating goals of their treatment or navigate the system. When they know what it is that they're going to be dying of, we can support folks in having the most ideal death for themselves under the circumstances. And then after death, we can help the family members or those that are tasked with wrapping up the affairs of the life of the person who died. We can support them getting that done because that's quite an undertaking. And I totally mean that pun. It can be a lot of work to do. So doulas are doing, broad scale support around the dying time.
Your sort of impetus, similar to so many, was a death in your family. And I thought it might be wonderful to honor him, your sister's husband, Peter, who passed many years ago now. you had this experience, and that was sort of what nudged you in the direction of this work. Would you care to talk a little bit about him so our listener can meet him and feel what I feel upon reading your book about Peter, which is such a warmth and a generosity of spirit that both of you offered one another that really inspired me when I was reading this?
I think that's absolutely accurate. And as you mentioned his name, a big smile broke across my face. And I must say, I think I'm really lucky in this regard that for many of us, somebody dies and we only talk about them with people that knew them, and only every once in a while, and as time goes on, their name fades from our tongue. Because of the work that I've done that Peter inspired, I get to talk about him all the time. So Peter is still so much alive in my heart, in my mouth, in my world. And that makes me so happy. And I feel really lucky because of that. My sister met Peter when I was probably 21 years old. And so I grew into adulthood with this brother. We took a liking to each other, even though we were so different. Peter was super conservative and, was a proponent of the death penalty. And I was like, are you out of your mind? And we would go to war about these issues in the world that we had very different viewpoints on. And I was determined to turn him into a justice project. Like I just knew he would get it one day. And some things he eventually got, and some things it's just who he was. He was gregarious and staunchly righteous and hilarious and playful, and he loved my sister. And I loved him as a human. I loved him as a brother-in-law. I loved him as a brother. We got to journey together through life for a little over 10 years when he became ill with Burkitt's lymphoma. I learned about that about 6 months after I came back from Cuba, after I had a big awakening about the fact that we will all die. Then here's somebody in my family who has a very serious illness. And my mom, she had uterine cancer at the time as well. And yet Peter's disease developed much quicker than my mom's. My mom's body responded very well to treatment, and Peter's didn't so well. So about 4 months into the treatment of his illness, the doctor said that they couldn't treat him anymore. They didn't say that he was dying. They just said they couldn't treat him anymore, which are different. And also for somebody who's just holding on so much hope, I chose not to hear that he was dying. And yet something inside of me was like, girl, are you sure? Because this is not looking good. And sure enough, I went to New York where him and my sister and my niece were for the last 2 months of his life. And I got to journey with them all the way in and through and around and about and up and down and inside out for the wildest ride of the end of his life. I am forever grateful for the gift of getting to care for him. I got to, first of all, give so much care to somebody that I cared about so deeply, but also it grew my sense of compassion because suddenly I saw how devastating the process is for anybody who's in the system. I didn't want people to suffer the same way.
Yeah. On page 49 of your book, in the Peter chapter, you walk us through, and for our listener, I think this is an important sort of bookmark for you if you want to read the book. You speak about those last few weeks of his life as, quote, one long treacherous day of power naps, looking for parking in New York City, snacks instead of meals, doctors, misinformation, hospital elevator banks, and impending doom. And this is really a question I ask with so much respect and care. I have no idea why this came to mind as I was reading it, but I put it into the margin. What do you think the possibility would have been had you known what you know now to actually just get him out of that hospital and bring him home to pass?
I think about that all the time. All the time. And also it's something that I pose to the death doula students because once we have the information, once we know what's possible, it's easy to look back with so much judgment and sadness about what we actually experienced. And yet I give myself and all of us a lot of grace because the doctor started talking about hospice on, I think, Friday morning. Because it was Friday morning, it was too late to do intake at any hospice. On Sunday, he fell unconscious and he died on a Wednesday. So he died in the hospital. We never even got hospice services. And if we would have, it would have been too late anyway. And I wish we'd known that we were that close so that he could be in his bed. We could hold vigil. We did in the hospital anyway. The grace that I keep extending is that Peter did it in the only way that he was going to, because that's what happened,
Right. Right. Yeah. You know what? Considering who he was, I reckon he would never have assented to going home to die,
No,
like a hippie.
no, I don't think so. I think he was probably also really concerned about what memory that would have left for my sister and my niece at home,
Yeah, that makes sense,
Yeah.
actually. That is a
Yeah.
big
And I think
consideration.
he was also still trying to stay in the fight. Like, even though there were hints that he had some awareness that his death was coming, I think it's hard to hold. So I don't know if he ever would have been like, you know what, let's just go home.
Right. Most likely not. My next question is about Lael. Is that how I pronounce her name?
Yes, my baby girl.
How is she?
She's great.
Amazing.
She's 14.
Wow. That's Peter's daughter
Yeah.
for our listener, and she's written about extensively in the book. Good. She's happy.
Yes. And sweet and just as righteous as her father about issues around like gender and sexuality and expression. And I'm like, get it, girl. But on the right side of the equation, if you ask me, she falls on the right side.
If there were to be a right and a wrong, which there isn't, and we know it, she's on the right side.
If there were to be, she would be on the right side.
Go, girl. Go, Lael.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That's sort of where I wanted to selfishly go in our conversation today. I wanted to hear a little more color on that whole situation. It meant a great deal to me to read about him. Is there anything that you feel would be beneficial to our listener who is, sort of maybe walking this path already, or volunteering, or considering it, or even considering what it would mean to plan their own death?
Yeah. That death is our greatest teacher. How somebody dies is how we learn to do it, but also how I'm going to die is going to teach me a lot about myself. And when I am not imminently looking at my death, when I can look at it from some distance, it shines a light on exactly the type of life I want to lead. There's no part of my life that my death won't touch. I mean, it'll be the end of it. So I'm thinking about my relationships and my work and my body and my pleasure and my food. And I'm thinking about who I am in society. I'm thinking about my family. I'm thinking about every part of my life. And it allows me to really zero in on those areas, those elements that maybe I'm not living in whole authenticity, or perhaps there's still something more I want to experience or a way that I want to be in the world in any of those areas. And I can see that very, very clearly with exacting certainty when I'm considering my death. And so if there is any spark of curiosity in you, dear listener, about your mortality, my invitation is to just step a little bit closer. You're not going to die just because you're thinking about it, because you're going to die anyway, but not because you're thinking about it, not because you're getting closer, not because you're curious. And so keep walking in that direction. There's a beautiful pot of gold that sits there, and that pot of gold is you.
Thank you so much for that. I marked also page 79. I underlined it and started. It really struck me. You were in a training, the midwifery training, and you wrote, every person in the room seemed like a variation on these two. Older, overwhelmingly white, silver-haired, lots of scarves and tie-dye. Nonetheless, there was no doubt that these were my people. And this is what I underlined. All of us felt the pull toward that inky, dense, indescribable moment in human life, the terminus point that gives life its meaning. I starred that, and I rewrote the subtitle of the book, Making an Authentic Life by Getting Real About the End. And I want to thank you for this, because this Making an Authentic Life, for me, the reflection that it spawned upon reading the book some weeks ago, I read it before I went away on a trip, and I was gone for 3 weeks. It was a pilgrimage. It was in the Zen tradition that I practice. It was with a bunch of my teachers. And it gave me such a lens, a clear, bright lens through which to look at everything, through which to listen to everything. And I cannot thank you enough. And I want to implore our listener to really take this to heart. How can you make an authentic life by getting real about the end of it? What would you do differently if you knew? This is one of Tracy Stanley's dear teachings from her book, The Luminous Self. What would you do if you knew you had an hour, a week, a month? What would you do? Really consider that, listener. And Alua, I just can't thank you enough. You're a hero to me, to so many. And your work is exquisite.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your website, if you wouldn't mind to tell our listener where they can find you, where the best places are to find your work.
Gladly. Goingwithgrace.com is a great place to begin. There you'll find information on our trainings and workshops and webinars and events and newsletter and all the happenings at Going with Grace in our deathy world you'll find there. Also on any social media not any. I hear people are really into TikTok nowadays, but Instagram and Facebook at least. You can find us easily. And you can find me in those places as well. But look for Going with Grace because that's where all the juice lies.
Great. Thank you so very much for being here. And I wish you continued incredible success. And I look forward to our paths crossing once again.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.